I remember the smell first. Not grief exactly. More like lilies beginning to turn in warm air, furniture polish, and that faint mineral smell that lingers after too many people have come through a house in damp shoes. It was late afternoon in Charleston, South Carolina, and the place had not been quiet for a single hour since we returned from my husband's burial. People like to think noise sounds like life. It doesn't always. Sometimes it sounds like people rearranging themselves around someone else's absence. I was still wearing black. Not the sharp, tailored kind magazines like to photograph. Just a soft black dress I'd had for years. One that fit well enough and didn't demand anything from me. I came down the back staircase slowly, one hand on the rail, and stopped when I heard my son say, "Don't expect a dime from Dad's 84 million. He said it casually. That was the part I noticed. Not angrily, not even defensively. Just casually, as if he were discussing the weather or parking. A few people laughed. Then my grandson, Tyler, who was 28 and far too old to still treat cruelty like a form of entertainment, said, "She's still up?" I figured she'd be in bed by now. Another laugh followed. Lower this time, more relaxed. My daughter-in-law, Dana, had a champagne flute in her hand. I remember the lipstick mark near the rim, coral pink. She tipped the glass toward me as if we were sharing some private little joke and said, "We were just trying to make some practical decisions." Practical. That word gets used a lot when people want something that belongs to someone else. The front room was crowded. Cousins, in-laws, grandchildren, a neighbor or two who had somehow become family during the useful years and turned into spectators the moment a house became part of the conversation. Sticky notes had already appeared. Blue, yellow, bright green, on the walnut sideboard, on the leather chair in the den. On the grandfather clock, my husband once spent an entire winter repairing because he believed good mechanisms deserved patience. I looked at the note on the clock. "Tyler!" All caps. That's when the room went quiet for half a second. Not because anyone felt ashamed, just because they realized I had seen it. Then the noise started again. Someone in the dining room was talking about opening up the layout. Someone else said the upstairs sitting room would make a good fitness studio. Dana mentioned changing the kitchen backsplash because it looked too heavy. I stood there and listened, while people redesigned a life I was still standing inside. My usual chair at the dining table was gone. In its place, near the swinging door to the pantry, sat a narrow folding chair with a metal frame. One leg didn't sit quite level. It made a soft clicking sound every time I touched it. "You can sit there for now," Dana said. "It's a little calmer." I looked past her into the dining room where 12 place settings had already been arranged. My linen runner down the center of the table, my silver polished, my husband's old decanter catching the light from the chandelier. Calmer, apparently, meant farther away. At the time, I didn't say anything. That seemed to unsettle them more than anger would have. Some people mistake silence for permission. I sat where they told me to sit. I ate what was put in front of me. Dry chicken. Potatoes gone cold in the middle. A roll so hard at the edges it scraped the roof of my mouth. I drank watered-down iced tea while. From the next room, I heard my granddaughter Brooke say, "If they move her downstairs, we could use the primary suite by summer." Someone answered, "Before summer." That got a bigger laugh. I kept my hands folded around my napkin and looked at the pantry door because it was easier than looking at their faces. There was a tiny chip in the paint near the brass knob. I remembered exactly when it happened. Christmas, maybe 12 years earlier. My husband carrying too many boxes of ornaments and bumping the door with his elbow. He had said, "Don't let me touch the fragile things next year." And I'd laughed so hard I had to sit down. It's strange what the mind saves when people around you are trying, very gently and very efficiently, to erase you. A little after 6, Tyler wandered over with his phone in one hand and another sticky note in the other. He leaned against the doorway and said, You know, Gran, you should probably start thinking smaller, less upkeep. Then he stuck the note on the silver-framed photograph beside me, a picture from our 30th anniversary trip to Maine. The two of us standing on a dock with wind in my hair and George squinting into the sunlight. He smiled like he was doing me a favor. I peeled the note off after he walked away and folded it into a neat square. I didn't throw it away. I put it in my pocket. Later, I understood why that moment mattered more than I did then. Around 7:30, Dana came into the pantry area, carrying a stack of folded towels and a bottle of unscented lotion, the kind that usually turns up in hospital gift bags. "We set up the downstairs utility room for you," she said. "Just temporarily, until everything settles." Everything. Such a useful little word. It never specifies who gets to settle and who gets removed. I looked at her. Really looked. Her smooth hair. Her watch face lighting up every few seconds at her wrist. The impatience she was trying to present as concern. "The utility room," I said. "It's actually more comfortable than it sounds." I nodded once. That seemed to relax her. She took my calm for surrender. People often do when they have never had to build anything themselves. By 8, my suitcase had already been moved. No one asked which things I wanted. No one asked whether I intended to sleep where they had decided I would sleep. I found my clothes in 2 cardboard boxes near the washer and dryer. One box said keep, the other said sort later. A cot had been pushed against the wall with a moving blanket stretched over it. The room smelled faintly of detergent, dust, and that metallic dampness lower rooms collect, even when they aren't quite basements. I sat down on the cot and listened to the house above me. Laughter, footsteps, a burst of music from someone's phone, a cabinet door closing too hard. Water running somewhere overhead. The house was still mine on paper. That was the missing authority signal. They had not earned anything yet, but they were moving as if authority had already transferred. That kind of presumption leaves a trail. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and felt the folded, sticky note. Then the heavier edge of another paper tucked behind it. Cream stock, slightly worn. A copy, not the original. There are differences you learn to feel with your fingers after enough years handling documents. Weight, fiber. The way the ink settles into the page instead of floating on top of it. I held that page for a moment in the utility room, under a bare bulb that buzzed once it warmed, then slid it back into my pocket and made my first decision of the evening. I would not react in that house. I would proceed. The next morning, the weather turned grey, in that flat coastal way Charleston has in spring, where the sky doesn't promise a storm so much as press down on you. I woke at 5:12 because, for a few seconds, I forgot where I was. I thought I was upstairs in my own room, and George was in the bathroom shaving, and that if I waited another minute, I would smell coffee. Then the dryer vent clicked somewhere behind the wall, and I remembered. I sat up slowly. My knees had stiffened during the night. The moving blanket smelled like storage. Above me, someone crossed the kitchen in shoes hard enough on the floorboards that I knew it wasn't one of George's old business friends, or any of the careful people from his professional life. It was family. Family stomps. I changed clothes, pinned my hair back, and went upstairs before anyone else had fully gathered. In the kitchen, the light over the sink was still on. One of Dana's wine glasses stood near the faucet with dried lipstick around the rim. Someone had left the refrigerator door slightly open, and the motor was working harder than it should have been. Little things like that bothered me more than the larger humiliations in those first hours, maybe because they were still fixable. I closed the refrigerator and opened the drawer where we kept pens, rubber bands, postage stamps, and old takeout menus. The contents had been disturbed, not carelessly. Searched. That's when I remembered another drawer, a much older one. 15, maybe 16 years earlier, George had come home after dark carrying a legal pad, and a face he thought he could control. He set his briefcase on the kitchen floor instead of the chair, which he only did when his hands were shaking. I was making soup. Lentil, I think. The onions had browned a little too far because I'd been listening for the garage door. He leaned against the counter and said, "We need collateral by Friday." I remember stirring the pot, the spoon tapping the side once, steam clouding the window over the sink. My answer came before I had fully thought it through. "How much?" He looked at me then. Not the way husbands look at wives in films. More tired than that. More honest. Enough that I can't ask. That was the line. That was all he gave me. By morning, I had a velvet box on the bedspread and a jeweler's card in my handbag. Back in the present, I shut the kitchen drawer and took out my phone. They had not taken my phone yet. That felt like an administrative oversight on their part. I stepped onto the side porch where the air smelled damp and green, and I called Martin Kessler's office. Martin had been our attorney for years, though "our" is not always the right word in a long marriage. Sometimes one person has a lawyer and the other person has a front row seat. Still, Martin knew me, better than most people did. His assistant answered. I said, "This is Evelyn Mercer. I'd like the earliest available appointment." There was a pause, a soft shift in tone. Then, "Of course, Mrs. Mercer. Mr. Kessler can see you at 10:30. No sympathy voice. No exaggerated softness. I appreciated that. Procedure, when done well, is a kind of respect. At 9, Dana found me putting on lipstick in the downstairs powder room. Nothing bright. Just enough colour to suggest I was not disappearing. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Out." She waited, as if expecting an explanation. I gave her none. That's when everything began to change, though it didn't look like much yet. Just an older woman in a beige coat picking up her handbag from the hall table that had once belonged to her mother. Dana followed me to the front door. "We've got people coming by later," she said. "A contractor and someone from staging." I turned. "Staging?" She blinked once. "Just preliminary conversations." I nodded. "Then they should probably wait." Her face shifted, just slightly. Confusion first, then irritation. She wasn't expecting that answer. When I reached Martin's office, the rain had started. Not hard, just enough to leave the sidewalks looking polished. His building sat 3 blocks off Broad Street in one of those old brick structures where the elevators always feel narrower than memory says they should. His receptionist offered me coffee. I declined. My stomach was too careful that morning for coffee. I didn't make myself. Martin came out himself and led me into a conference room with glass walls and a long walnut table. On the sideboard sat 3 binders, a legal pad, and a shallow dish of peppermints that nobody ever really eats in those rooms except nervous men. He waited until the door was closed. Then he said, "What happened?" Not, "How are you?" which would have been useless. Not, "I'm sorry for your loss," which had already been said too many times by people in pressed jackets. Just the question that mattered. I took the folded sticky note from my pocket and set it on the table first. He looked at it. Tyler. Then I set down my phone and played a short voice memo. I had recorded it the night before without much thought beyond instinct. My son's voice, my granddaughter's laugh. The phrase, "before summer," Dana saying, "practical decisions." Martin did not interrupt. After the recording ended, I reached into my bag and pulled out the cream-colored paper I had felt in the utility room. A memorandum from years earlier. My name on it in blue ink. Evelyn Mercer, co-trust contributor and early capital guarantor. Not a ceremonial title, not social, financial. The lawyer looked up and paused. People use that phrase loosely. In real life, pauses are usually very small. This one lasted maybe 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, I watched him recalculate the entire room I had just walked out of. "Do they know?" he asked. "No." "Did George intend them to know?" "Eventually," I said. Maybe not from him. Martin leaned back. Rain tapped against the windows behind him in a soft, uneven rhythm. Tell me everything from the beginning. So I did. Not in one clean speech, in pieces. The way memory actually arrives, I told him about the jewelry, about the bank transfer, about the year George's manufacturing firm nearly buckled under debt exposure and a supplier collapse, about the proposal that came later, when the board wanted a growth model and George had ideas but no shape for them. That memory came back to me with unusual clarity. I was at the kitchen table in socks because my feet were cold. There was chamomile tea in a mug with a chipped rim. George had left a stack of draft notes near the salt cellar and gone upstairs after midnight without looking at me. He had said, "I'm out of language." That was his line. I sat there with a yellow legal pad and one of those pilot pens I liked because the ink ran clean and dark, and I wrote for 3 hours. Not as a wife trying to help, as a strategist who had been invisible long enough to work without interruption. The refrigerator motor hummed. A sprinkler clicked outside. My hand cramped twice. At some point around 2:30, George came halfway down the stairs and said, "You should sleep." I didn't look up. "You should win." He stood there for a moment, then went back upstairs. That handwritten framework became the basis for the company's expansion presentation 6 months later. Martin took notes while I spoke. Occasionally he asked for a date, a bank name, a likely year. Then he did something I respected. He did not rush to comfort me. He moved to verification. "We need copies of everything," he said. "We also need the trust file, the transfer records, the revised estate packet, if one exists, and anything tying authorship to the expansion model." "There is something else," I said. I told him about the royalty notices. He stopped writing. "Royalty notices?" I nodded. "Quarterly, routed to a dormant holding account." His pen set down very carefully. "Evelyn, what exactly did George file?" "I don't think he filed it under his own name at first." Martin's expression shifted from concern to professional focus, so cleanly it seemed to cool the room. There it was. Institutional confirmation. He called his paralegal in. Anna, late 30s, navy sweater, hair clipped back, no wasted movement. She brought a scanner, extra notepads, and one of those grey expanding folders that seem to promise seriousness the moment they land on a table. We spent the next hour building a record. Copying is an oddly intimate act when it concerns your own life. Page after page, passing under glass. Dates reappearing. Signatures aligning. Old numbers regaining force because they have been put in order. After 2 evidence actions in a row, the pressure arrived. At 12:14, my phone lit up with Dana's name. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then a message came through. "Where are you? Contractor is here. He needs access to upstairs." A second one followed. "Also, Martin called the house landline looking for you." Why? Interesting. So they were already noticing procedure. I showed Martin the screen. He said, "Don't answer yet. There is relief in being told not to engage when engagement would only serve the wrong people." By 1:30, he had enough to do what needed doing first. Retain counsel formally, review the estate status, confirm title restrictions. Place notice on any attempt to market or transfer property before probate conditions were satisfied. And, most importantly, request the sealed addendum George had lodged 6 months before his death. I hadn't known there was a sealed addendum. Not exactly. But I knew George had gone back to Martin's office twice last fall without saying much afterward. One of those mornings he came home, smelling faintly of rain and carbon paper, and said, while hanging up his coat, "Sometimes timing matters more than explanation." I had asked, "Is that a legal principle?" He smiled without humor. "It is today. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Later, I realized it mattered more than I understood. When I returned to the house a little after 3, A black SUV was parked out front, and two men in golf shirts were standing in the entry hall with laser measuring devices. Dana met me before I had both feet inside. "We thought maybe you weren't coming back," she said. That sentence told me more than the words themselves. I took off my coat slowly and handed it to no one. That was optimistic. One of the men glanced between us and suddenly became fascinated by a section of crown molding. Dana lowered her voice. "We're just exploring options. For a property you do not own," I said. Again, she wasn't expecting that answer. That evening, the house shifted. Not outwardly, no apologies, no sudden conscience. Just a subtle recalibration. Lower voices, fewer jokes made in my hearing. My son Andrew called me Mom twice instead of she. Pressure changes language before it changes behavior. The next morning, Martin's office sent the first formal notice. No disposition of assets, no contractor engagement beyond preservation work. No removal of inventoried personal property. No representations to third parties regarding occupancy, ownership, or transfer authority. By 10 o'clock, Andrew was in the study shouting on speakerphone to someone from a real estate office. I couldn't hear the other voice, but I heard him say, "No, there's been a misunderstanding." There had been one, yes, but not the kind he meant. That afternoon, I went upstairs for the first time since the funeral and opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. The room smelled faintly of lavender sachets and old wood. My sweaters were gone from the top drawer, but the false bottom in the chest had not been found. Inside was the original folder, leather worn at the edges, my handwriting sample pages, the first bank transfer receipt, an unsigned copy of the capital support memorandum, and the draft of the expansion model, written under the working name E. Lane. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the first page in both hands. There was a tea ring in the corner. I remembered making it. I remembered being annoyed with myself. Memory becomes a kind of evidence when it can still be tied to paper. I called Martin from the bedroom. "I found the source set," I said. He went quiet, then said, "Bring it in." Back downtown, Anna logged each document with small white tabs and a numbered sequence. Source material, supporting correspondence, financial tie-in, draft evolution, potential authorship markers. A handwriting analyst was brought in 2 days later. Not some theatrical television version, just a very careful woman named Dr. Irene Walsh, with grey-framed glasses and a voice like paper folding. She spent 90 minutes reviewing the draft pages, older greeting cards I had written, a set of board annotations in George's file, and a note I once sent his assistant about revised talking points. When she was done, she said, "The authorship indicators are very strong, not dramatic, not absolute. Strong. In institutional language, that can be stronger than outrage." That was the first clear confirmation, though it opened a larger question at the same time. What exactly had George preserved for me, and how far did it reach? I got the answer the following Monday. Martin called at 8:03. "We need you here by 9, he said. "Good or bad?" "Yes," he replied. His office had that brisk Monday smell of coffee, printer toner, and wet wool coats. The sealed addendum was on the table when I arrived. George's signature was on the outer page. Witnessed, notarized. Martin read it aloud in the same tone he might have used for a corporate covenant. That helped. It kept the words clean. The house would pass by life estate control to me immediately, without encumbrance from dependent beneficiaries. Certain discretionary bequests to Andrew and his lineal descendants remained conditional on conduct standards, including defamatory or degrading treatment toward me during the post-funeral administration period. Martin looked up there. "That clause is enforceable?" I asked. "It's narrow," he said. "But yes, especially with corroboration." There it was. The rule read calmly. No thunder, no grand gesture. Just law doing what law does when somebody takes the time to write it correctly. Then came the next page, a reference to the Mercer Growth Framework, described in the addendum as a foundational intellectual contribution associated with the company's restructuring and public scaling phase. George had attached a letter acknowledging that contribution as mine. I didn't react immediately. Sometimes the body takes a little longer than the mind to catch up to the truth. I just sat there, looking at my own name in a sentence. George had chosen carefully enough to survive him. Martin slid another file toward me. The holding account, connected to those quarterly payments, he said, is traceable to a licensing structure tied to a registered strategic model. The beneficial owner is a trust where you are now sole controlling party. I looked at him. How much? He told me. I won't repeat the exact number here because money changes shape in memory, but it was more than enough to make the room feel a degree colder. The paperwork already had my name on it. That sounds dramatic written down. In the room, it sounded more like breathing. Andrew arrived at the office uninvited at 11:20. He had probably called enough people by then to realize that nobody in real estate or finance was willing to take his instructions anymore. Dana came with him, carrying indignation the way some women carry designer handbags, as if it improves the outfit. The receptionist tried to intercept them. Martin allowed them in for exactly 12 minutes. I remember that because Anna checked the wall clock when the voices began to rise. Andrew started with performance. "Mom, nobody's trying to hurt you. We're all under pressure." Martin held up one hand. "This is not a family mediation. This is a state administration." Dana tried next. "There's been some confusion about who intended what." Martin turned one page in the file. "No, there has not. Procedure does not bend for people who are used to being the loudest person in the room." Andrew looked at me then, really looked at me, maybe for the first time in years without assuming the ending. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. I answered honestly. "You never asked the right question." That shut the room down more effectively than anger would have. Before they left, Martin informed them of the first consequences. No access changes to the residence. No contractors. No asset tagging. No removal of personal property. All future communications through counsel regarding estate matters. Dana said, "This is absurd." Martin replied, "It is documented." That was the point where consequence became real. After that, the story split, the way these things often do when money and pride start coming apart at the same time. The financial lane came first. By Wednesday, Andrew's request for a bridge loan against an anticipated inheritance had been denied. I learned that not because a banker called me with gossip, but because Martin's office received notice of attempted reliance on a non-vested beneficiary interest. Compliance language has a very dry sound to it, but once you learn to hear it, it can be oddly satisfying. The social lane appeared that same afternoon when Mrs. Bell from across the street caught me at the mailbox and said, with forced brightness, "I heard you're downsizing. Neighborhood rumor always moves faster than probate." I smiled. "You heard wrong." She blinked, then looked embarrassed in the way people do when they realize they have been carrying someone else's version of events, like a casserole dish. Thursday morning, the financial lane tightened again. Martin forwarded notice that all estate-linked disbursements required dual authorization pending final review. No discretionary advances, no occupancy-related reimbursements, no informal distributions. Andrew called 3 times. I let him leave messages. "Mom, this is getting ridiculous. Can you please tell Martin to stop escalating this? Dana says there has to be a reasonable way to handle things." Reasonable, in that context, meant easier for them. On the social side, the club women stopped calling Dana back about the memorial luncheon she wanted to host in George's honor. It turns out, people become careful when a lawyer's office has already spoken to key vendors about unauthorized representations. Friday at 2, 40 inches the afternoon. Building staff from George's downtown office reported that Dana had attempted to collect what she called personal executive effects from his suite. Access denied. Inventory locked pending instruction. That was the moment everything changed for her. Not emotionally, logistically. I still remember her face that evening. She came into the kitchen without makeup for the first time all week, set her keys down too hard on the counter, and asked, "Did you tell them not to let me in?" I was making tea. I said, "No, the records did." For Andrew, that kind of answer would have felt unexpected. For Dana, it was worse. She had never imagined there might be a system beyond people. The next day, my granddaughter Brooke tried a social countermove. She came downstairs, wearing a cream sweater and a face carefully arranged to look wounded. "Grandma," she said softly, "I think maybe things got out of hand. Maybe." I poured hot water into a mug and waited. She touched the back of a chair. We were all grieving. "I was aware of that," I said. She opened her mouth, then changed direction. "Do you really want lawyers involved? Doesn't that just make everything uglier?" There it was. The family version of pressure. Don't name what happened. Naming it makes it worse. I looked at her and thought about the little girl who used to ask me to braid her hair before school. Then I said, "No, Brooke, the behavior made it ugly. The paperwork is just where it gets measured." She cried. Real tears, I think. But not all tears are repentance. Some are simply disappointment that the door they expected to open has a frame around it. The turning point came 3 days later in Martin's office, when Andrew and Dana sat across from us, signing acknowledgement of the estate restrictions. Andrew tried one last time. "This house is our family home." Martin slid the occupancy document toward him. "You can't take what was never yours." Simple line, calmly delivered. It settled over the room like weight. By then, the financial and social lanes were fully alternating. Monday, notice of suspended discretionary access to a brokerage subaccount Andrew had assumed would roll directly to him. Tuesday, whispers through church circles that maybe George had left things more thoughtfully than people realized. Wednesday, formal review of a vehicle title transfer Dana had been describing as already promised. It wasn't. Thursday, the caterer from the funeral brunch declined to extend credit to Dana for a private event once estate billing authority was clarified. Friday, Brooke texted to ask if she could come by and talk, just us. I said no. People often call you cold when you stop serving as insulation. Then came the institutional tightening. A compliance letter regarding attempted beneficiary reliance, a temporary hold on non-essential property movement, a filing preserving my residential control and quiet enjoyment rights during administration. Nothing cinematic, no courtroom speech. Just systems, closing around bad assumptions one click at a time. Andrew's tone shifted exactly the way predictable men shift once authority moves out of reach. First performance. "This is insane. Dad never wanted division." Then panic. "I may have made decisions based on what I was told." Then procedural compliance. "Please send any forms that require signature." I signed what needed signing. So did he. The weather turned warmer by then. Azaleas along the sidewalk had begun to drop their blooms, and pink petals collected in the cracks beside the front steps. I noticed things like that because my pulse had slowed. Once procedure takes hold, the body can return to observation. One evening, near the end of the second week, I walked through the house alone with an inventory sheet. The sticky notes were still there on some pieces, because no one had dared remove them, and no one had earned the right to keep them there. I peeled them off one by one. The leather chair, the clock, the sideboard, the piano bench. I folded each note and placed it into a plain white envelope. Tyler's, Brooks, Dana's handwriting. Even Andrew's, on the study desk lamp, he had apparently already assigned to himself, without ever asking where it came from. At the bottom of the envelope, I wrote one date, then I filed it. That is the kind of gesture people don't understand unless they know what it feels like to be talked over for a very long time. I wasn't keeping souvenirs. I was preserving sequence. A few days later, Martin arranged the formal reading. Not because the will required theatrics. It didn't. But because structure matters, and a room with a transcript is sometimes kinder than a hallway full of informal lies. The conference room was colder than it needed to be. Offices often are. Andrew sat nearest the window. Dana kept checking her phone until Martin asked that all devices be placed face down on the table. Tyler looked annoyed. Brooke looked pale. No one seemed particularly interested in me until Martin began. He read the dispositive provisions first. Residential control to me. Primary estate authority as structured. Conditional reductions to Andrew's line based on documented degrading conduct. Then he introduced corroborating materials. My voice memo. 2 witness statements from staff who had been present in the house after the funeral. Photographs of asset tagging. 1 contractor email referencing Dana's description of me as transitioning out. That's when the room went quiet. Not the brief social silence from the first night. This was heavier. The kind that settles when people realize they are no longer participating in a story, they are inside a record. Then Martin read George's letter. He did not make it emotional. He did not need to. George wrote that I had supplied capital when conventional channels failed, that I had materially shaped the company's restructuring logic, that he had protected those facts imperfectly during his life and intended to correct that failure after his death. Imperfectly. That word undid me more than I expected. I didn't cry there. I just looked down at my hands and noticed how still they were. Andrew spoke first. I didn't know. It's the line people use so often when what they really mean is I never bothered to learn. I answered, that became expensive. Martin did not smile, but Anna did, very slightly, while looking down at her notes. The final numbers were reviewed. Some bequests contracted sharply. Some privileges disappeared entirely. The licensing income was confirmed under my control. The residence remained mine to retain or sell in my own time. Quiet, structural resolution does not feel like triumph, not at my age. It feels more like air returning to a room. Afterward, Tyler tried to approach me in the corridor. I was joking about the sticky notes, he said. No, I told him. You were rehearsing. He didn't ask what I meant. Maybe he already knew. Within 48 hours, they were gone from the house. No dramatic exit. Just cardboard, zipper sounds, car doors, and the awkward little dignity of people being forced to follow rules they had mocked a week earlier. Dana left behind a scarf on the coat tree. I mailed it to her in a padded envelope with no note. Andrew stood in the front hall just before he left and looked older than he had at the funeral. I don't know how we got here, he said. I thought about answering in full, about telling him exactly where it began. Not with the will, not with the funeral, not even with the first insult. It began years earlier, when usefulness replaced affection and assumption replaced conversation. Instead, I said, by small permissions. He lowered his eyes. That was enough. I stayed in the house through winter and into early spring, long enough to hear it settle again, long enough to decide whether I still belonged there once the noise was gone. In the end, I sold it, not out of spite. Homes absorb events, and that house had carried too many versions of me. Wife, hostess, buffer, mother, background. I wanted walls that had not listened to me being reduced. I moved west after that, to a smaller place above the water near Monterey. White curtains, salt air. Hardwood floors that warmed in the afternoon sun. A kitchen just large enough for one person to cook without feeling lonely. The kind of apartment where nothing echoes unless you want it to. The licensing income continued, though I scarcely touched most of it. Instead, I set up a private grant program for women whose work had been used, borrowed, softened, or buried beneath someone else's name. No galas, no speeches, just review panels, careful criteria, direct funding, and letters that began with a sentence I wish more women heard earlier. We can verify your contribution. That line still pleases me. Some mornings now I make tea and sit near the window while the marine layer hangs low over the water. I think about George sometimes, not sentimentally. More the way one reviews a file that mattered very much and was never simple. He failed me in some ways. He protected me in one final, structured way. Both things are true. And sometimes I think back to that first night in Charleston. The folding chair, the sticky notes, the dry chicken, the easy confidence in my son's voice when he assumed I was already gone in every way that mattered. Some people mistake silence for permission. They forget that silence can also be observation, timing, record keeping, the quieter version of strength. If stories about quiet boundaries resonate with you, you're welcome to stay. Because in the end, they thought I was fading. I was only waiting for the paperwork to catch up.